towards the beginning of this year, there's some major conversation concerning VRAM.
What I believe to be definitive proof that 8GB of VRAM is no longer sufficient for high-end gaming.
And it starts loading in, figure there's no big deal or anything, it just crashes.
And it was making very capable and performance graphics cards like the RTX 3070 feel obsolete in 2023. Over time, throughout this year, this conversation has vanished. Is this because we're just sick of hearing about VRAM? Or is this VRAM problem not relevant anymore? Depending how this goes, many of the most popular GPUs in the world only have 8GB of VRAM, and in just a couple years, they could be completely crippled in terms of performance. On top of that, the real issue is, what other options do we have to buy? So let's jump in and do some tests. I got a bunch of games, some to revisit from early in 2023 and some that are more recent. I found out in each of these games how much VRAM they could use at maximum using my 7800 XT. Because it has so much VRAM, it's usually not an issue in a lot of games. This is going to allow us to see the compromises that we have to make in these games in order to get these GPUs to run properly. When I turn on the recording, we just dropped from 38 to 33 FPS. Or if they're going to run at all. Let's jump in. All right, so the 8GB RX 6600 in The Last of Us Part 1. We are at 1440p here, but you can see that this card is actually able to run the game at a locked 30 FPS if we wanted to. Obviously, before I tested this with the 7800 XT, and this game was asking for 11GB of allocated VRAM and 8.5GB of actually used VRAM at 1440p high settings. We can't do that on the 6600, so you can see our VRAM is down a little bit further. So what can we do to mitigate this? So apparently, if you drop the textures to low with the 7800 XT, I was able to get us down to 7.5GB of used VRAM. So let's go ahead and try that and see. These textures are the most VRAM demanding thing in a game typically. Now, that's not always true, but we got about a couple more frames. So it didn't really change a whole lot. And honestly, the frame times have been pretty consistent as well. But let's also see how this performs at 1080p instead. On the 7800 XT, I was able to get the VRAM to hit 8GB of used, and it was allocating 10.4GB for this game. Now, you're probably going to be playing this at 1080p with the 6600. This is a $200 graphics card. I kind of wish I had access to like an RTX 3070, which is more like a 1440p graphics card. We work with what we got. You know what I mean? That's how it is. And you can see that we're getting like 60 FPS, and the allocated VRAM is not nearly as high as it was at 1440p. So obviously, this is pretty playable at high settings and a very stark contrast from when this game launched. All right, let's go ahead and check out the RTX 3080 with 10GB of VRAM in this game. The 10GB RTX 3080, which has really great performance, but is severely limited in VRAM in a lot of cases. So here we are in Last of Us Part 1 at high settings, and we have no resolution scaling, 1440p native. This is the resolution that you'd actually be using a 3080 to play at. We can see in the top left, we've had a lot of improvements with VRAM usage within this game, because allocated memory is under 8GB on high settings, 1440p. Like, that is actually quite a feat. But we also saw that on the 7800 XT that this was using or allocating 11GB, but using 8.5. We can also see that on an Nvidia card, interestingly enough, we're using almost 2GB less of VRAM at the exact same settings at this resolution. I don't think this is affecting performance at all. So let's go ahead and check it though. 85 FPS just standing here. What happens if we go ahead and drop the settings down? Textures at 86 FPS, going to low settings. The game, I can see, does look significantly worse, especially on Joel here. But yeah, we gained 1 FPS by turning those settings down. Let's see how this stacks up within the other games. The 8GB RX 6600 in Forspoken, this game has been using a lot of VRAM. It's using about 6.2GB of VRAM, and it's allocating about 7.25 or close, getting kind of close to 7.3 at times. If we turn on ray tracing, that it uses quite a bit more. It is using a little bit more VRAM. So let's go ahead and up this to 1440p and see if that becomes a problem or not. Genuinely, it's about the same as 1080p. It seems like we're anywhere in the range of 6.2 to 6.3 gigabytes of usage at 1440p with 8 gigabytes of VRAM on this card. If that would affect our frame rate if we were to turn down textures or something. We're at 24 FPS there. Our VRAM is about the same, but our FPS did change slightly. Now I have the lowest textures on right now anyways, and I'm not that impressed with the detail here. But what happens if we up the textures or model detail to high? Like what happens in this game? I just saw the grass change. You can see that the ground texture is about the same. Yes, certain games handle VRAM differently. In this game, it just lowers, if you don't have enough, just lowers all of the model detail. Obviously, at least it's playable on 8 gigabytes, but the compromises that you have to make kind of sucks because you don't exactly even know that you're having VRAM problems in this game, but you might just think the game looks bad. The 10 gigabyte RTX 3080 at 1440p high settings within Forspoken, allocation of about 8.6 to 5 to 7 or something on terms of VRAM, but actually only using 7.5. What I did want to check out though is if we go up to the textures compared to the RX 6600, yeah, these textures look better on the RTX 3080 compared to the 6600 with less VRAM. It's kind of weird, but it seems like the VRAM goes further on Nvidia GPUs, even though this card probably should have more than 10 gigabytes. Yes, there is a 12 gigabyte version of the 3080, but that card was kind of a ripoff. So, all right, we're on the 8 gigabyte 6600 here in Plague Tale Requiem. Now, this game doesn't actually use a whole lot of VRAM. However, though, as you up the resolution, problems with this game with the RTX 3070 where it would chug quite a bit. But you can see, at least on this card with this kind of power level at 1080p, it's easily running this game at like 4 gigabytes of VRAM. It's really not a problem in this specific case. Again, I wish I had a more powerful 8 gigabyte graphics card to show this often, because this card with the 6600, I think most of the time 8 gigabytes is actually okay for the speed of this card. I mean, high settings 1080p, that's honestly a good ask for a entry level graphics card, and it's playing this game at close to 60 FPS. Like, I can't really complain about it. That's fine. All right, we're now at 1440p, and we got more of a cinematic 30 FPS experience going on here. Obviously, this card isn't the fastest GPU in the world, so 1440p is kind of a big ask. There is a little bit of ray tracing you can do in this game. Maybe that's what will up the VRAM requirements heavily, but we'll check that out on the RTX 3080 and see if that becomes a problem. The 10 gigabyte RTX 3080 in a Plague Tale Requiem. This game obviously did have some VRAM issues before, but 10 gigabytes seems like it's plenty. And with the 7800 XT, I was seeing 6.7 gigabytes of usage here, with 8.3 gigabytes of allocated VRAM. This is again a stark difference between that. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing that the Nvidia card is using less VRAM. Okay, just turned ray tracing on. You can see I'm getting some stutters in this game. Yeah, so all ray tracing really does in Plague Tale Requiem is make the shadows look a little bit sharper, but for the most part, it doesn't really do anything else. You can see we're getting massive stutters in terms of the performance, and that is because of VRAM problems here. So what's really ironic is how much Nvidia actually advertises ray tracing for their graphics cards, but the moment that you turn it on, the VRAM usage goes up, and then it's really difficult to use it. Even though this card is actually fast enough to do ray tracing in this game, you can see when it stabilizes, we're getting like 60 FPS. We're allocating close to 10 gigabytes of VRAM now, but we're actually only using under 6. So you can see, you know, it is allocating that VRAM. It might not be using it, but that is causing performance problems clearly as you pan around the frame here. Now, we could obviously, if we really wanted to, we would get a little bit more performance, and we would be able to lower the VRAM usage if we turn on something like DLSS, if we turn it to quality. That would help the VRAM probably quite a bit here. And obviously, running at a lower resolution is going to make the game easier to run as well. Although I still see some kind of crazy frame times here. I'm going to reset the frame counter. For all the people that do say that allocated VRAM doesn't really matter and it's only the used VRAM you should care about, it's not entirely true. All right, we're on the 8 gigabyte 6600 in Starfield here. Obviously, this is high settings, which is maybe asking a little bit too much for this graphics card again. As far as Starfield is bad at optimization, like I wish we could play at 1080p high settings on an entry-level graphics card. But at the same time, VRAM is also pretty low, although I'm not gonna go out here and claim that the models and textures within Starfield are absolutely amazing or anything like that. But this is an example with newer titles is like, well, you can still have games that look pretty good without crazy amounts of VRAM. Maybe even using more VRAM within this game would make it run better. But let's go ahead and throw this on 1440p and check out how much VRAM it uses there. Yeah, pretty demanding. We're getting like under 30 FPS, but again, the VRAM is only at about 4 gigabytes and allocating like 5. So yeah, let's go ahead and check out the RTX 3080 in it. Obviously, it's probably going to be fine. We'll just be brief. Okay, the RTX 3080 in Starfield, high settings at 1440p, and what we are seeing is really... It's kind of crazy how little VRAM this game can use. On the 7800 XT, which is a 16 gigabyte card, I was using 4.4 gigabytes and allocating 6.1. Our actual usage is under 4 gigabytes right now. Well, I don't think the models are insane or the textures are insane, but it's under 4 gigabytes, guys. I mean, that is pretty wild. This is a new game, and not every game has to use a ton of VRAM. Is it actually a problem? Has this problem kind of disappeared? Let's go ahead and hop into another game real quick, because this one isn't all that bad. Okay, so the 8 gigabyte RX 6600 in Alan Wake 2. Obviously, this is the minimum specs graphics card, but it only has 8 gigabytes. The other minimum specs card was the RTX 2060, which has 6 gigabytes, I'm pretty sure. So this one does have actually more VRAM than that card. The VRAM is decently high in this game compared to, say, Starfield or in Remnant 2, which I wasn't able to test this card. I'm having a lot of problems with Remnant 2 right now. Yeah, we're probably hitting some memory problems here. Standing here staring, we're getting at literally 30 FPS, or it just fluctuated, 32 FPS. What happens if we turn down the texture resolution to low? Obviously, we're seeing a lot less in terms of the VRAM utilization, but at the same time, the FPS isn't really changing. So maybe it would affect frame times. Like maybe sometimes the game would get very spiky or something like that, and having more VRAM might allow it to be more comfortable and it wouldn't spike as much. Okay, at 1440p native on the high preset, textures are back up again. Wow, the FPS is a lot lower. You can see that we're getting about the same VRAM usage as we did at 1080p, which means we're definitely VRAM limited here. Let's go ahead and turn down texture resolution low, and apparently this only uses 5.8 gigabytes of VRAM. Did that affect performance? Doesn't look like it. It looks like we're still hanging around that 20 FPS mark, somewhere in there. It doesn't seem like we're VRAM limited or it's actually causing problems with VRAM within this game. Again, every game handles a VRAM differently. 10 gigabyte RTX 3080 and Alan Wake 2, one of the most demanding games that we've seen recently. Yeah, it's also pretty demanding in terms of VRAM. And on the 7800 XT, I was seeing 9.8 gigabytes of allocated VRAM and 8.1 gigabytes used VRAM. Between Nvidia and AMD here, honestly, it's pretty similar. You see that we're getting about 53 FPS just standing here, not doing anything. Let's go ahead and see what happens if we drop the texture resolution down to low. We're literally getting the same frame rate, but we see dramatically lower VRAM usage in the top left. Honestly, I'm still not complaining about like the low textures within this game. Like they don't really bother me a whole lot. So it seems like in like Alan Wake 2, if you have extra VRAM, you might as well just crank the textures. I mean, that's how it is basically in every game. Just textures use the most VRAM. If you have extra VRAM, like 16 gigabytes or something, you might as well just crank them up to max. VRAM can definitely be an issue in certain games. However, I think in a lot of the ones that I tested here today, it was pretty manageable, at least on these graphics cards, which can even be pretty VRAM limited a lot of the time. Last of Us over this year has had a ton of performance updates, and honestly, it was not that bad here today. On the other hand, Forspoken, which isn't the most popular game, so maybe not the best representation, it does have some issues with the textures not wanting to load in if you don't have enough VRAM. Is you might not be aware that you're actually VRAM limited in the game, but the game is just going to look bad but still run fine. Although surprisingly, in a lot of the more recent games like Starfield or Remnant 2, which is built in Unreal Engine 5, these games are very like graphically demanding, but surprisingly they don't use a ton of excess VRAM. But maybe these games could actually benefit from using more VRAM on our graphics cards. I know that's a scary, slippery slope, but maybe they would perform a little bit better if they had access to more memory to store data and streamline things in a little bit more properly. Then also looking at Alan Wake 2, which is very graphically demanding, this game did use a decent amount of VRAM. I don't think it was anywhere in the realm of excessive. Now, I would have loved to have tested more games that have had VRAM issues over this year, like Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart, or even Jedi Survivors, or the full version of Resident Evil 4 Remake. So unfortunately, I do not own these games. You guys can let me know your experiences with other VRAM demanding games that came out in 2023 in the comments below. Some games throughout this year, they launched and they were extremely crazy and overly demanding in terms of VRAM, but it seems like over time, like especially thinking of Last of Us Part 1, it has really gotten better and been a lot more manageable. It seems like devs are able to handle this to some degree, but at the same time, I've seen that many devs are kind of sick of optimizing games to work on 8GB graphics cards.
And even for me, trying to stay below the 8GB target, we have to do so much work to make it happen.
But they've been forced to over the years, because what other options are there? And it's funny because this whole VRAM discussion really wouldn't be happening if we had more options to choose from as consumers. I mean, a good chunk of the most popular GPUs in the world only have 8GB of VRAM in 2023. The cheapest graphics card that has more than 8GB of VRAM in 2023 is the RX 6700 XT at $310 right now. And that is a good deal in terms of the market and the climate that we're in, but I wouldn't call $310 exactly entry level. And if you want to go onto the Nvidia side, which is a little bit more mainstream, you got to jump all the way up to $430 to get the 16GB 4060 Ti if you want more than 8GB on Nvidia. And that card still has a 128-bit bus, which means that 16GB of VRAM doesn't even perform like actual 16GB of VRAM on other cards with a wider memory bus. So you could think of this like it's partly the game developers' fault for not making games like or pushing VRAM limits pretty heavily. But at the same time, just in 2016, 7 years ago, 8GB on graphics cards was completely mainstream with the GTX 1070 and the RX 480 8GB graphics cards. That was mainstream back then, and apparently it's still mainstream now. We've seen a huge amount of stagnation literally within 7 years. It's kind of crazy. Although I did really find it interesting when I was testing these games, Nvidia graphics cards use significantly less VRAM compared to their AMD counterparts. And if you guys know why that is, just comment it below, because I'm kind of curious. Again, I'm not a graphics engineer. I don't know exactly why this is the case, but Nvidia seems to use less VRAM. Though I am 100% sure Nvidia using less VRAM in these cases is not an excuse for them to not give us any VRAM, like an 8GB 4060 Ti for $400. It is kind of a win-win for AMD to include more VRAM with their cards because it's good for marketing and, you know, it actually solves a problem that their cards have. But VRAM at the moment in 2023 does seem like devs are able to get it under control. And even the games that we saw earlier this year that really were pushing limits and had a lot of problems with the VRAM, now it seems like a lot of those issues have been handled. And that might be why this conversation has slowly faded over the course of the year. But with the trend that we're on with the stagnation of our GPUs, and honestly, devs probably want to start pushing the limits of these GPUs at some point. We see a lot of games wanting to push it graphically, but I still think VRAM is going to be a major issue in the coming years, especially with new GPU releases. And I'd really love to be seeing more VRAM on the more budget level entry graphics cards that most people are going to be getting. So You know, you're not limited by VRAM in just a few years. Let me know your guys' experience with VRAM in your graphics cards and the type of games that you play, because you might just avoid the heavier games on VRAM because it doesn't work with your card or something. So let me know what you guys have experienced throughout this year. So you guys have a good one. I'll see you in the next video. Peace.